Good afternoon. It's Matt Gracey with Danna-Gracey. We are very pleased to have this webinar today on the topic of adding a new physician to your practice. We have questions about malpractice insurance issues with adding physicians almost every week. So we have done this webinar a couple of times, and we still seem to be getting folks interested in it and asking questions, which we love, and so forth. So let's jump in, and we'll give you some real great information that will add to your knowledge and make it much easier to deal with when these issues come up. So it's really a matter of, let's see here, let me get the technical issues going. It's really a matter of the question of, do you want to add a doctor with or without their retroactive coverage? And a couple of things we can eliminate early on. If it's a new doctor, a new to practice doctor, just coming out of residency, there are really no issues there. We get that question a lot, believe it or not, of, hey, how do we cover a doctor's period during residency, or are there any issues of doctors coming out of residency that we need to be concerned with? And the answer is no. There's really nothing. They have their own coverage. It's generally on what we call an occurrence form basis. So if you have a doctor just brand new to private practice, there are no issues on that front. It gets a little trickier when a doctor is coming from another practice, or their solo practice, or another group, and so forth. Again, lots of different ways doctors will be joining your practice, but if they have had coverage before, that's where you have to really pay attention to what the ramifications of the retroactive coverage issue. So the very first thing that we have found that's the most important is to figure out exactly what are the obligations of the newly added doctor as far as their previous employment contract goes. We've gone way down the road before with adding doctors, and then all of a sudden somebody will look at the contract that the doctor had with his old group and find that, oh, well, he absolutely has to buy a tail, or no, he or she can actually have retro coverage moved onto your policy. So I always advise before even getting into too deep into this issue with a new doctor, figure out exactly what the contract issues are. So then the next thing is to get the pricing of the tail from the old coverage from his old insurer, and compare that pricing with moving the coverage in without him buying the tail, him or her buying a tail, and just bring in the retroactive coverage forward. Most often, tails are expensive, and the cheaper way to do it is to not have the doctor not buy a tail, but to bring the retroactive coverage forward. Now, that's not always the best for the group, though, and so there's issues there that we need to talk about. But let's go down a couple more points here before we get into that discussion. The other thing is to get the new policy pricing. So if you're going to have the retro coverage moved over instead of the tail, of course you need to get the new policy pricing to compare to the tail price. And again, this assumes that the doctor does not have any contractual obligation on which way to go, either buying a tail or moving the retro. Now, there could often be issues about the limits of the coverage too. We often find that doctors moving in from other parts of the country have very high limits. We had one last week. A doctor came in from Chicago and had $2 million, $5 million limits. Well, it's not just unaffordable in Florida, but probably ill-advised as well because of the deep pockets issue. And so we were able to get the carrier in this instance to do a blended rate for covering the retroactive exposure in Chicago at the 2 million, 5 million limit, and then having a new policy. In this case, it was a $500,000, $1.5 million limit that the group wanted the doctor to carry in Florida. And so we did a blended rate. We can often get some of our carriers to do that. It's never guaranteed, and they want to know a lot about the previous exposure and so forth. But it is possible, and so always have that knowledge that when you look at a doctor that you're considering adding to the group, and if they show you a policy with just astronomical limits, that don't worry, we can often work around it. The other really important thing is to really get a handle around what's the claims record for the new doctor that's joining your group. Again, if they're a new doctor out of residency, no worries. But I can tell you that we've had many, many instances in my career where we get a phone call fairly late in the process from one of our group administrators saying, hey, we're adding this new doctor, can you send me over the application and so forth. And then we find out that the doctor is very, very claims challenged. And I get put in a position of calling an administrator back saying, this is just a really not a good idea to add this doctor, and they're going to completely blow your group's great claims history and so forth, and make the entire group policy go up, which can happen. Because again, once you add a doctor to your group, all of the claims record is now examined every year by the insurers to see what kind of pricing they should give the group. So sometimes we're able to kind of carve out a doctor that is very claims challenged and have them not on the group policy. But again, then there's issues as well about common defense and so forth. There are some instances where we can add a doctor with the same company and the same insurance company that the whole group uses, but then add them to the non-standard part of the same insurance company, so that at least in the case of a multi-defendant lawsuit within the same group, you'll have common defense, which again is very important and something that just really needs to be handled correctly. So let's move on. Some of these issues also come down to which perspective are you looking at? Are you coming from an employer perspective or an employee perspective? So let's talk about it from the employer perspective first. And that is, you really, a newly employed doctor will often come in and say, well, gee, I've had this company I've been insured with, and I really don't want to leave them, and I'd rather just have my own policy and not go on to the group policy and so forth. It's just not a good idea, again, because of the common defense issue. The last thing you want is for multiple doctors in a group to be sued. Those doctors have different insurance companies, different claims representatives. and so forth. And all of a sudden, the fingers start pointing instead of having a unified common defense. The plaintiff attorneys love it when doctors all start pointing fingers at each other, because they then take full advantage of that, and things don't go very well from there. The same type of issue applies when there's different policy limits. We do have groups that have different policy limits, because some doctors, just strongly believe in either high limits or low limits and so forth. And so we do have some groups that do carry different limits for their docs, but it's never a preferred situation, because of course the doctors with the high limits in the group will become the deep pockets of the docs with the low limits. Same thing with bear doctors practicing with doctors with coverage. The doctors with the coverage become the deep pockets for the bear docs, who early in a case will say, hey, I have no coverage and I've protected my assets, so pound sand, guys, you're on your own here. So it becomes a bit of a tricky situation. You also want, as an employer, to make sure that your corporate coverage is handled appropriately, of course. Not only does a new physician have coverage for themselves, but often the corporate coverage is added on a shared limits basis to each of the doctor's policies. And in that case, the doctor could leave, and if they don't buy a tail on the way out, and we're going to talk about that next, if they don't buy a tail on the way out of your employment, then your corporate coverage in many instances evaporates, and because they're off to another group and so forth. And so if the group ever gets sued for something the doctor did, the doctor would get sued as well, but the corporation in that case often would not have coverage. So you need to be very careful about when there's shared limits of liability for the corporation, and having an employed doctor leave, that you make sure that there is continuing coverage for the corporation. The way around that, of course, is to buy a separate limit of liability for the group professional liability. And many groups do that, but some groups save money and don't do it and just add the coverage on, again, as a shared limits basis. The separate limit of liability for the corporation is certainly recommended. It's not double the price, and that's one of the good things. So with many doctors just carrying $250,000 in coverage, when you add on a group corporate protection, then you double, in essence, double the limit in the event of a claim, and it's often priced anywhere between 10 and 25% of the doctor's policy. So it actually turns out to be a very good deal. Of course, the insurance companies can price it lower because they're handling the case already and so forth, so they can save on their expenses, and it just works out really well for everybody. So if you don't have a separate corporate limit, then you certainly should consider that. Let's talk about one of the things that really can become very troubling in regards to doctors leaving, and actually when you're practicing, during the time they're with you, it's important as well to get the employment contract language right in regards to malpractice insurance. I can tell you that through the years we've seen some really horrendous malpractice insurance wording on employment contracts. And we've seen a number of lawsuits come out of confusion about the language on employment contracts, and most often in regards to this very issue of tails and who's responsible for the tails, and do they have to buy a tail versus allowing them to take their retro elsewhere and so forth. So let's talk about it. And we always, with our clients, ask our administrators and doctors to just let us review a copy of your employment contract, and we'll give you a number of suggestions to make it much clearer. Again, one of the things that we've observed is many healthcare attorneys do not understand the issues of tails particularly, and so the wording can be confused at best and sometimes ambiguous. And again, the last thing you want is to be in the middle of a lawsuit over just some misunderstandings because the wording of your employment contract was not right in this regard. In fact, it can get even worse. We some years ago had to testify in a case where a doctor was supposed to buy a tail, but gee, the language was a little unclear in the employment contract. And then of course a claim came up, and the corporation was sued, the doctor was sued. It turned out the doctor was bare because he didn't buy a tail, and the whole thing became a legal mess. So again, heed the warning, and we'd be happy to review and give you recommendations on the malpractice part of your employment contracts. So, real simplistically, clarity is probably the most important part. Who is going to be paying the premium? Who's going to pay the tail? Or are you requiring a tail when a doctor leaves? Or are you going to allow the doctor to actually take their retro? This very point we could talk about for quite a while, but let me briefly touch this subject. Of course, tails are expensive, and so a departing physician always, from their perspective, wants not to purchase a tail. They want to be allowed to take their retroactive coverage and move it to their next employment spot. Now, sometimes that's impossible if they move out of state and so forth, but very often it is possible for a doctor to move their retro and just not purchase a tail. But there's some issues with that. And here are the issues. Let's say a doctor moves out of state, and you don't have in your employment contract that they have to purchase a tail. Well, next thing you know, 2 years hence or something, the corporation gets sued and the doctor gets sued. Well, the doctor could have, purchased a policy or not. They could be bare at this point. The corporation might even be bare again if there had been shared limits and the corporation was protected on the doctor's policy that they then took with them. There's a real problem there because again, then the corporation is handling a claim for a doctor who is in essence could be bare and will not be rendering much of a defense like they should. So we always recommend, and it's never a popular recommendation, but we always recommend the cleanest way to have this go for a doctor who's leaving is for the group to put in the employment contract that they must purchase a tail. That leaves the group on very high ground because once a tail is purchased, it's a clean break then. There are really no worries. If a claim ever comes in, then you can easily, just contact the insurer, and the claim is handled. If you allow a doctor to take the retro, then, and if that's something that the group agrees to do in an employment contract, then we recommend in the employment contract wording that the doctor, must fulfill the obligation to keep the coverage at the same limits and with a insurer of the same quality, the same AM Best rating as their coverage that was provided during the employment at the group. So, and then we also advise that you should get evidence of the insurance every year for 5 years. And we're going to talk about the statute of limitations and so forth in just a little bit. But again, here a group's being nice by not having a doctor purchase an expensive tail, but now you have to really chase that doctor for 5 years to make sure that the doctor is carrying adequate coverage and in some cases still has the evidence that the corporation is still named on the policy and so forth. And that can be very cumbersome, to say the least. And again, you all have enough to do instead of trying to chase doctors down for evidences of insurance years after they've left your practice. Again, a reason that a tail is a clean break and no issues. So as I said, we recommend in the employment contracts that just putting in wording that they have to purchase a tail, then you're on that high ground. And here's what I advise too. Once you're on the high ground as a doctor's leaving, you can then change it if you want. If the doctor's, if it's a really good termination situation, a good divorce, as I say, and a friendly situation, and he's going to, somewhere that you can get your hands around him, and he's a good guy, and everybody knows that he always does the right thing. He or she, of course, does the right thing. Then you can always say, well, we have it in the contract that you have to purchase a tail, but gee, we're going to change that so you don't have to do that, and you can just take your retro coverage with you and send us evidence of insurance. We trust you. But as we know, some of these terminations are very difficult at best, and you really don't want to be in that situation. So the next issue about tails is that there is now a fairly robust standalone tail market. What that means is that you don't have to go now just to the incumbent carrier, the incumbent insurer, to get a tail. And so that's good and bad. Tails, as I say, are fairly expensive, but the rough estimate is double the annual premium, and that's what a tail will cost. And so here's the issue, and again, we have one going on right now, actually, with a client, a group that has a doctor leaving, and they have in their contract that the doctor has to purchase a tail, but they didn't have in their contract that the doctor has to purchase a tail from a carrier with the same rating, the same AM Best rating is the best, because some of these other rating agencies we don't think very highly of. AM Best is the gold standard, so we always recommend that. And then also with the same limits and with roughly the same policy form, so that there's not a bunch of exclusions. Remember, there's an awful lot of small carriers in the market now, and a lot of excess and surplus lines carriers that are basically not regulated by the state of Florida. And a departing physician can get a tail quote from a number of insurers that basically, one, don't handle tails or claims very well, or two, are very financially unstable. And we would never recommend anyone putting coverage with them. And so, you really want to be careful that a doctor who's departing and has this tail requirement doesn't just show up with, yeah, I bought a tail and here it is, and it'll be a very inferior policy, and things can really go wrong from there if, in fact, you get some claims that come in. So it's very important, again, for employment contract wording to get it right. And one of the other problems with the standalone market tails is that some of the tails are of different length. Most of the standard companies in Florida have tails that are of infinite duration. So, once you purchase a tail, if a claim comes in, 30 years from now, which, by the way, it won't. We're going to talk about the statute of limitations here in just a moment, but that would be prevented. But in Florida, let's get into it right now. There's a 2-year statute of limitations for cases, but don't be deceived, because there's also a 4-year statute of repose, they call it, which extends the statute of limitations for a number of cases, and often comes into play in cases that are not discovered until for a while, and so forth. So again, you have to be very careful about that. Now, so in essence, an infinite tail is what you want. There are a number of companies out there now selling 1-year tails or 2-year tails. Well, a 1-year or 2-year tail doesn't help a whole lot, at least in the state of Florida, and would be completely undesirable to a group to have a doctor who's departed by just a 1 or 2-year tail, because then there could be a huge gap in coverage. And then for any doctors who deal with children, the statute of limitations actually gets extended to the kid's 8th birthday. So I know many doctors don't deal with kids, but again, you can see that a 1 or 2-year tail that some doctors will present to you if an employment contract is not worded properly is really just not adequate at all. So let's talk about the corporation. Again, we've really kind of gone through this, the tail versus retro issue, that if you have a shared limit of liability for the corporation, it becomes very important with most insurers that a tail is purchased versus allowing a doctor to take retro. And, so it all boils down really to the separate corp versus shared corp issue. And we, of course, recommend that groups buy separate limits of liability, but some don't. And some companies will allow, even with a shared limit of liability with the corporation and the doctor's policy, that if the doctor departs and doesn't buy a tail, that the corporation is still covered or can be covered. But some insurers do not allow that. So you just have to make sure that, again, the coverage is adequate. And it really comes down to the next slide, and the next recommendation is, make sure you have a reputable healthcare attorney, and make sure that you have a med-mal insurance expert really help you with your contract language to get this right. So that's all I have for today. You know now a whole lot more about tails and retro coverages and adding physicians and so forth to your practice. I hit really the highlights of the issues, and again, feel absolutely free to call us to discuss these issues in more detail and for your particular circumstance. And with that, I will wish you well. Have a great day.